The morning tea grew cold as Camilla stared at the newspaper headline that would change everything. In the grand halls of Windsor Castle, where whispers had always carried more weight than shouts, a political earthquake was about to reshape the very foundation of the British monarchy. What started as routine parliamentary discussions had exploded into a constitutional crisis that would test the limits of royal tradition, political power, and personal resilience. For decades, the British public had watched Camilla's journey from scandal to acceptance, from mistress to queen consort. But now, in an unprecedented move that shocked even the most seasoned political observers, members of Parliament were seriously considering something that had never been attempted in modern British history: the formal removal of a sitting queen consort from her royal duties. Behind closed doors, powerful forces were aligning. Ancient constitutional laws were being dusted off and examined. Secret meetings were taking place in the shadowy corridors of Westminster. And, at the center of it all stood Camilla, facing the greatest challenge of her controversial yet remarkable life. This is the story of how a routine political session became a royal revolution, how personal vendettas collided with constitutional law, and how one woman's determination to protect her position would either secure her legacy or destroy everything she had worked decades to build. The crown jewels weren't at stake. Something far more valuable was the very future of the modern British monarchy itself. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Clarence House as Camilla sat in her private study, reviewing the morning's correspondence. The familiar routine of royal duties had become second nature to her after years of careful cultivation of her public image. Letters from charities, invitations to state functions, and briefing papers from her private secretary created neat piles across her mahogany desk. Everything seemed perfectly normal until her equerry, James Morrison, knocked on the door with an urgency that immediately caught her attention. "Your Majesty," James said, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of concern. "I'm afraid there's been a development that requires your immediate attention." Camilla looked up from the literacy charity proposal she had been reading, noting the unusual tension in James's voice. In her years of royal service, she had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when something was seriously wrong. The way James held his shoulders, the slight tremor in his voice, and, most telling of all, the fact that he had entered without waiting for her permission to speak. "What sort of development?" she asked, setting down her fountain pen and giving him her full attention. James moved closer to her desk, lowering his voice despite the fact that they were alone in the room. "There's been chatter in Westminster, ma'am. Unusual chatter. My contacts in Parliament are reporting some rather concerning discussions taking place behind closed doors." Camilla had long ago learned that in the world of royal politics, rumors and gossip were as dangerous as actual legislation. The British political system thrived on speculation, and the monarchy had always existed in a delicate balance with parliamentary power. She had witnessed firsthand how quickly public opinion could shift, having lived through her own transformation from one of the most hated women in Britain to the respected queen consort. "Be specific, James," she said, her voice carrying the authority she had developed over decades of navigating royal protocols. "A group of MPs have been meeting privately to discuss what they're calling constitutional reform. The meetings started small, ma'am, but they're growing. Our sources indicate they're examining precedents for limiting or removing royal duties from individual members of the royal family." The words hit Camilla like a physical blow. She had always known that her position was more precarious than other members of the royal family. Unlike those born into royalty, she had married into it later in life, carrying with her a complicated history that many had never fully forgiven. The public's acceptance of her had been hard-won, built through years of dedicated service and careful public relations management. "How reliable are these sources?" she asked, her training in royal diplomacy keeping her voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in her mind. "Very reliable, ma'am. Lord Pemberton's office contacted us directly. He wanted to provide advance warning before things progress any further." James paused, clearly uncomfortable with the next part of his report. "There's more, Your Majesty. The discussions aren't just theoretical. They're actively researching legal mechanisms." Camilla stood from her chair and walked to the window, looking out at the London streets where ordinary people went about their daily lives, blissfully unaware of the constitutional crisis brewing in the halls of power. The irony wasn't lost on her that just this morning she had been reviewing plans for her upcoming visit to a women's shelter, continuing her work to support victims of domestic violence. Now she found herself potentially facing a different kind of assault altogether. "Who's leading this effort?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Margaret Thornfield appears to be the primary organizer, James confirmed. She's been building a coalition of backbenchers, and some sources suggest she has support from more senior MPs as well. Margaret Thornfield. Camilla knew the name well. The Conservative MP from Yorkshire had made her political career by positioning herself as a defender of traditional values and constitutional purity. She had never hidden her disapproval of Camilla's integration into the royal family, often making pointed comments in interviews about the importance of moral character in public life. Thornfield represented a segment of British society that had never fully accepted Camilla's transformation from the woman who had contributed to the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage to the respected royal consort she had become. What legal mechanisms are they exploring? Camilla asked, turning back to face James. The 1701 Act of Settlement is being examined, along with various constitutional conventions that have governed royal duties throughout British history. They're also looking at more recent precedents, such as the way certain royal privileges were modified for other family members who had caused constitutional concerns. Camilla knew the history well. The British monarchy had survived for centuries by adapting to changing political and social climates. Various kings and queens had faced challenges to their authority, and the institution had evolved to meet those challenges. But what was being discussed now was different. This wasn't about modifying the behavior of a monarch who ruled, but about stripping duties from a consort who served. The implications were staggering. If Parliament could successfully remove a queen consort's duties, it would set a precedent that could fundamentally alter the relationship between the monarchy and the elected government. The carefully maintained balance that had allowed the royal family to maintain their position in modern British society could be irreparably damaged. Have their majesties been informed? Camilla asked, referring to Charles and the broader royal family. His Majesty has been briefed, ma'am. He's currently meeting with his constitutional advisors to understand the full scope of what's being proposed. Camilla felt a mixture of gratitude and apprehension at this news. Charles had stood by her through every previous crisis, but this situation was different. As the reigning monarch, he had to consider not just his personal feelings, but the broader implications for the crown. If Parliament was serious about pursuing this course of action, Charles would be forced to navigate between his role as her husband and his duty as king. The phone on her desk began to ring, its sharp tone cutting through the tension in the room. James moved to answer it, but Camilla gestured for him to wait. Let it ring, she said. We need to think strategically about how to handle this situation. As the ringing stopped, Camilla began to pace the room, her mind racing through the possible responses to this unprecedented challenge. Her years in the public eye had taught her that in times of crisis, the most important thing was to control the narrative before others could define it for you. What's the timeline? She asked. How quickly are they planning to move? The preliminary research phase appears to be nearly complete, ma'am. Sources suggest they could begin formal discussions within the next few weeks, possibly as early as next month. The timeline was alarming. If Thornfield's group was ready to move that quickly, it meant they had been planning this for months, possibly longer. The fact that the information was only now reaching the royal family suggested that the secrecy surrounding the effort had been remarkably effective. Camilla returned to her desk and pulled out a leather-bound notebook where she kept track of her most sensitive correspondence and meetings. She had learned long ago that in the world of royal politics, documentation was crucial. Every conversation, every meeting, every decision had to be carefully recorded and analyzed for potential future implications. I want a complete list of everyone involved in these discussions, she said, beginning to write. Not just the MPs, but their staff members, advisors, anyone who might have influence over the process. Yes, ma'am. I'll have that compiled within hours. I also want to know what public support, if any, exists for this kind of action. Have there been polls, focus groups, public statements from major newspapers, or political commentators? James nodded, understanding the direction of her thinking. I'll coordinate with our media monitoring team to provide a comprehensive analysis. As Camilla continued to outline her response strategy, she felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through every previous crisis. She had faced public humiliation, media scrutiny, and political opposition before. Each time, she had not only survived but had emerged stronger and more resilient. This situation, however, was different in scope and potential consequences. The previous challenges to her position had been primarily matters of public opinion and media coverage. This was a direct challenge to her constitutional role, backed by the formal power of Parliament. The weapons being used against her were not newspaper headlines or public protests, but the fundamental laws that governed the British state. The phone began ringing again, and this time Camilla nodded for James to answer it. As he spoke quietly to the caller, she continued to develop her strategy. The first priority would be to understand exactly what legal mechanisms were being considered and whether they had any realistic chance of success. The second priority would be to identify potential allies within Parliament who could oppose or slow down any formal action. "Ma'am," James said, covering the phone's mouthpiece. "It's Lord Chancellor's office. They're requesting an urgent meeting." The involvement of the Lord Chancellor confirmed the seriousness of the situation. As the government's chief legal officer and head of the judiciary, the Lord Chancellor would only become involved if there were genuine constitutional questions at stake. "Tell them I'm available immediately," Camilla said. As James confirmed the meeting, Camilla began to understand that this crisis would test not just her personal resilience, but the very foundations of the modern British monarchy. The careful balance of tradition and democracy that had allowed the royal family to maintain their position in the 21st century was about to be subjected to its greatest challenge in decades. She looked once more out the window at the bustling London street below. In a few hours, news of this constitutional crisis would likely begin to leak to the media. By tomorrow, it would dominate every newspaper front page in the country. The British public, who had gradually learned to accept and even appreciate her role as queen consort, would be forced to take sides in a battle that would determine not just her future, but the future of the monarchy itself. The irony was striking. After years of working to modernize the royal family and make it more accessible to ordinary British citizens, Camilla now faced the possibility that this very accessibility and democratic accountability could be used as weapons against her. The same parliamentary system that had evolved to work in partnership with the monarchy might now be turned against one of its most dedicated servants. As she prepared to leave for her meeting with the Lord Chancellor, Camilla reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From her early days as a young woman in love with a prince, through the scandal and public hatred that had followed her relationship with Charles, to her gradual rehabilitation and acceptance as a working royal, every step had been a battle fought in the public eye. Now, she was facing what could be the final battle, one that would determine whether all her years of service and sacrifice had been enough to secure her place in British history. The stakes could not be higher, and the outcome would resonate far beyond her personal future, potentially reshaping the relationship between the British people and their ancient monarchy forever. The Lord Chancellor's office in the Houses of Parliament carried the weight of centuries of British legal tradition. As Camilla entered the oak-paneled room, she was struck by the formal portraits of previous holders of the office gazing down from the walls, their stern faces seeming to judge the unprecedented situation unfolding beneath them. Lord Chancellor Patricia Whitmore stood to greet her, her expression carefully neutral, but her handshake betraying a slight tremor that spoke to the gravity of their meeting. "Your Majesty, thank you for coming on such short notice," Patricia said, gesturing toward a pair of leather armchairs positioned near the room's imposing fireplace. "I'm afraid the situation requires immediate attention." Camilla settled into her chair, noting how Patricia's usually impeccable composure showed subtle signs of strain. The two women had worked together on various legal reforms during Camilla's tenure as queen consort, developing a professional relationship built on mutual respect. Patricia's careful formality now suggested that their personal rapport would not protect either of them from the constitutional storm they were about to navigate. "I understand there are questions being raised about my constitutional position," Camilla said, choosing her words carefully. In the intricate world of parliamentary procedure and royal protocol, every phrase carried weight that extended far beyond its literal meaning. Patricia nodded, opening a thick folder that contained what appeared to be extensive legal research. "The situation is complex, Your Majesty. A group of MPs, led by Margaret Thornfield, has formally requested that my office provide guidance on historical precedents for limiting or removing the duties of royal consorts." The formal nature of the request immediately elevated the seriousness of the threat Camilla was facing. This was no longer speculation or political gossip, but an official inquiry that would generate documented legal opinions with the full weight of government authority behind them. "What specific precedents are they citing?" Camilla asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "They've identified several historical instances where royal family members have had their roles modified due to various circumstances. The case of Edward VIII's abdication features prominently in their research, though the circumstances were obviously quite different. They're also examining the way certain privileges were modified for other family members throughout the 20th century. Camilla understood the strategy being employed. By framing their action as part of a historical pattern of constitutional adaptation, Thornfield's group was attempting to normalize what would otherwise appear to be an unprecedented attack on the monarchy. The comparison to Edward VIII was particularly pointed, given that his abdication had been precipitated by his relationship with a divorced woman, a parallel that Camilla's opponents would certainly not hesitate to exploit. What is your office's preliminary assessment of these precedents? Camilla asked. Patricia hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the position she found herself in. As Lord Chancellor, her duty was to provide objective legal advice to Parliament, regardless of her personal feelings about the wisdom of their inquiries. The precedents are not directly applicable to your situation, Your Majesty, she said carefully. However, there are constitutional mechanisms that could theoretically be employed to modify royal duties. The complexity lies in the fact that these mechanisms have never been tested in circumstances similar to yours. The admission confirmed Camilla's worst fears. While there might not be exact historical precedents for her situation, the existence of potential constitutional mechanisms meant that Parliament's threat was not merely political theater, but a real possibility with legal foundation. What would such mechanisms look like in practice? Camilla asked. Patricia pulled several documents from her folder, spreading them across the small table between their chairs. There are several possible approaches. Parliament could pass legislation specifically defining the duties and limitations of royal consorts. Alternatively, they could invoke existing constitutional conventions to formally request that the Crown modify your role. Each option carried different implications for both Camilla personally and the broader monarchy. Legislation would create a permanent precedent that could be applied to future royal consorts, potentially limiting the flexibility that had allowed the institution to adapt to changing circumstances. Constitutional conventions, while less formal, would rely on the cooperation of the Crown and could create ongoing tension between the monarchy and Parliament. Has His Majesty been consulted about Parliament's willingness to pursue either approach? Camilla asked. His Majesty's office has been informed of the inquiry, but no formal discussions have taken place regarding implementation, Patricia replied. However, I should note that the political pressure behind this effort appears to be building rapidly. The mention of political pressure prompted Camilla to consider the broader context surrounding this constitutional crisis. British politics had been increasingly turbulent in recent years, with traditional institutions facing unprecedented scrutiny and challenge. The monarchy had largely managed to remain above the political fray, but Camilla's situation might be providing an opportunity for ambitious politicians to demonstrate their reformist credentials. Can you share any insights into the political motivations driving this effort? Camilla asked. Patricia glanced toward the door, as if ensuring their privacy, before responding in a lower voice. Off the record, Your Majesty, this appears to be about more than constitutional principle. Margaret Thornfield has been positioning herself as a potential leadership candidate within her party. Taking on what she portrays as an outdated aspect of the monarchy could enhance her profile among voters who favor institutional reform. The revelation added a new dimension to Camilla's understanding of the threat she faced. This wasn't simply about her personal history or fitness for royal duties, but about her role as a political target of convenience for ambitious politicians. The realization was both insulting and strategically valuable, as it suggested potential vulnerabilities in her opponent's position. What kind of timeline are we looking at for any formal action? Camilla asked. Based on the requests we've received, I expect we'll be asked to provide our complete legal assessment within 2 weeks. If that assessment suggests that action is constitutionally feasible, formal proceedings could begin within a month. The accelerated timeline confirmed that this effort had been carefully planned and coordinated. Thornfield's group was moving with the kind of strategic precision that suggested they had been developing their approach for months, waiting for the right political moment to strike. Camilla stood and walked to the window overlooking the Thames, where tourist boats continued their regular routes despite the constitutional drama unfolding in the building above them. The normalcy of life outside the halls of power provided a stark contrast to the intensity of the crisis she was facing. Lord Chancellor, she said, turning back to face Patricia, I want to be very clear about something. I have no intention of voluntarily stepping back from my duties as Queen Consort. If Parliament wishes to pursue this course of action, they will need to do so through the full formal process, with all the scrutiny and debate that such action would entail. Patricia nodded, making notes in her folder. I understand, Your Majesty. That position will need to be communicated to the relevant parliamentary committees. I also want to ensure that any assessment your office provides takes into account the broader implications for the monarchy as an institution. This isn't just about my personal situation, but about the precedent that would be established for future attempts to use parliamentary power to influence royal duties. Absolutely, Your Majesty. Our analysis will necessarily address those institutional implications. As their meeting continued, Camilla began to develop a clearer understanding of the battlefield she would be fighting on. The legal mechanisms existed for Parliament to take action, but implementing them would require navigating complex constitutional terrain that had rarely been tested in modern British politics. The process would be public, contentious, and potentially damaging to all parties involved. The phone on Patricia's desk rang, interrupting their discussion. After a brief conversation, Patricia turned back to Camilla with a grim expression. I'm afraid that was my deputy. Word of the parliamentary inquiry has begun to leak to the media. We can expect public coverage to begin within hours. The news transformed the crisis from a private constitutional matter into a public political battle. Once the media became involved, the dynamics would shift dramatically. Public opinion would become a crucial factor, and the carefully controlled environment of parliamentary procedure would be replaced by the chaotic arena of public debate. What's the likely media response? Camilla asked. Based on past coverage of royal issues, we can expect intense scrutiny of both the constitutional questions and your personal history. The tabloids will likely frame this as a battle between tradition and modernization, while the broadsheets will focus on the legal and political implications. Camilla had lived through media firestorms before, but this situation presented unique challenges. Previous controversies had primarily involved her personal relationships and behavior. This crisis would require her to defend not just her character, but her constitutional right to serve as queen consort. I'll need to coordinate with Buckingham Palace's communications team, Camilla said. The Crown's response will need to be carefully crafted to address both the legal questions and the public relations aspects. Of course, Your Majesty. My office will coordinate with your staff to ensure that our communications are aligned. As their meeting concluded, Camilla reflected on how quickly the situation had escalated from private rumors to formal constitutional inquiry to public controversy. The speed of developments suggested that her opponents had been planning this campaign carefully, timing their actions to maximize impact while minimizing her ability to prepare effective responses. Walking through the corridors of Parliament toward her waiting car, Camilla encountered several MPs and parliamentary staff members whose reactions ranged from carefully neutral acknowledgments to barely concealed curiosity. The building that had once felt welcoming during her official visits now seemed charged with tension and uncertainty. Her phone buzzed with a message from Charles's private secretary requesting an immediate meeting at Buckingham Palace. The involvement of the King's office confirmed that this crisis had reached the highest levels of royal concern and would require coordinated response from the entire institution. As her car navigated through London traffic toward the palace, Camilla used the travel time to begin organizing her thoughts for the conversation with Charles. Their discussion would need to address both their personal relationship and their institutional responsibilities. As king and queen consort, they would need to present a united front while acknowledging the complex constitutional questions their marriage had created. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. After years of working to prove her worthiness to serve as Charles's consort and to support the monarchy's modernization, she now faced the possibility that her very presence in the royal family had become a liability to the institution she had dedicated herself to serving. The city streets were filled with the usual afternoon bustle, but Camilla found herself wondering how many of the people she passed had already seen the early media reports about Parliament's inquiry. By tomorrow, her face would likely be on every newspaper front page, and the British public would be asked to take sides in a constitutional battle that would determine the future relationship between their elected representatives and their ancient monarchy. As the palace gates came into view, Camilla steeled herself for what would likely be the most important conversation of her royal career. The decisions made in the next few hours would determine not just her personal future, but the precedent that would govern how Parliament could challenge royal authority in the modern era. The private audience room at Buckingham Palace had witnessed countless historic conversations, but the tension that filled the space as Camilla entered was unlike anything in recent memory. Charles stood near the window overlooking the palace gardens, his posture reflecting the weight of the constitutional crisis that now threatened to engulf both his reign and his marriage. The king's private secretary, Sir Michael Hartwell, sat at a small writing desk covered with legal documents and briefing papers, while the palace's chief constitutional advisor, Professor Margaret Fleming, occupied one of the room's antique chairs. "Darling," Charles said, turning to embrace Camilla as she entered. The simple gesture carried enormous significance in the formal setting, demonstrating his personal support even as they prepared to discuss the institutional challenges her position had created. "Your Majesty," Camilla replied, using his formal title to acknowledge the official nature of their meeting despite their personal intimacy. She understood that this conversation would need to balance their roles as husband and wife with their duties as king and queen consort. Sir Michael stood as she entered, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of the stress that had consumed the palace staff since news of Parliament's inquiry had reached them. "Your Majesty, we've been monitoring developments throughout the day. The situation appears to be escalating more rapidly than anyone anticipated." Professor Fleming, whose expertise in constitutional law had guided the monarchy through numerous previous challenges, gestured toward a chair positioned to face the group. "Ma'am, we need to discuss the legal and political dimensions of what we're facing. The implications extend far beyond your personal situation." Camilla took her seat, noting how the formal arrangement of the room emphasized the gravity of their discussion. This was not a family conversation, but a council of war, with the very survival of the modern monarchy potentially at stake. "What's our current understanding of Parliament's intentions?" she asked. Sir Michael consulted his notes before responding. "Margaret Thornfield's group has expanded significantly since this morning. We now have confirmation that at least 47 MPs have expressed formal support for their inquiry. More concerning, 3 cabinet ministers have indicated they're sympathetic to the constitutional questions being raised." The numbers were alarming. What had begun as a fringe movement was rapidly gaining mainstream political support. The involvement of cabinet ministers suggested that this effort had the potential to become official government policy rather than simply backbench political maneuvering. Charles moved away from the window to join the group, his expression grave. "We need to understand whether this represents a genuine constitutional concern or political opportunism designed to weaken the monarchy more broadly." Professor Fleming opened her briefcase and extracted a thick legal document. "I've been analyzing the historical precedents they're citing, Your Majesty. While there's no exact parallel to the current situation, there are constitutional mechanisms that could theoretically be employed to limit or modify royal duties." "Explain those mechanisms," Camilla said, though she suspected she already knew what Fleming would tell them. "The most direct approach would be parliamentary legislation specifically defining the role and limitations of royal consorts. Such legislation would require passage through both houses of Parliament and would create permanent precedent for future situations. Alternatively, Parliament could invoke constitutional conventions to formally request that the Crown modify your role voluntarily. Each option presented different challenges and implications. Legislation would be a direct assault on royal prerogative, establishing parliamentary supremacy over internal royal arrangements. Constitutional conventions would preserve some dignity for the monarchy, but would create ongoing uncertainty about the extent of parliamentary influence over royal duties." "What's the likelihood that either approach would succeed?" Charles asked. Professor Fleming hesitated before responding. "The legal mechanisms exist, Your Majesty. The political will appears to be building. The primary question is whether Parliament is prepared to face the constitutional crisis that such action would create." Sir Michael leaned forward in his chair, his expression reflecting the urgency he felt. "We also need to consider the international implications. The Commonwealth realms would be watching any action against Queen Consort Camilla very carefully. Several governments have already made discreet inquiries about the situation. The international dimension added another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. The British monarchy served as head of state for numerous Commonwealth nations, and any action that appeared to weaken or destabilize the institution could have far-reaching diplomatic consequences. Have we received any formal communications from Commonwealth governments?" Camilla asked. "Nothing formal yet, ma'am, but the Canadian High Commissioner specifically mentioned the situation during a routine meeting yesterday. The Australian government is apparently monitoring developments closely as well." Charles began pacing the room, a habit he had developed during times of intense stress. "We need to consider our response options carefully. Any action we take will be scrutinized not just domestically, but internationally." Camilla watched her husband struggle with the competing demands of his position. As king, he was obligated to maintain the monarchy's relationship with Parliament and preserve the institution for future generations. As her husband, he was determined to protect her from what he undoubtedly viewed as an unjust political attack. "What are our strategic options?" she asked. Professor Fleming pulled out another document, this one containing what appeared to be a detailed analysis of possible responses. "We have several approaches available, each with different risks and benefits. We could cooperate fully with the parliamentary inquiry, providing complete documentation and testimony. We could resist the inquiry as a violation of royal prerogative. Or we could attempt to negotiate a compromise that addresses Parliament's concerns while preserving your essential role." Each option carried significant implications. Full cooperation would provide legitimacy to Parliament's inquiry, but could establish dangerous precedents for future political interference in royal affairs. Resistance would preserve royal prerogative, but could escalate the conflict into a full constitutional crisis. Compromise might resolve the immediate situation, but could create ongoing uncertainty about the limits of royal authority. "What does public opinion suggest about each approach?" Camilla asked. Sir Michael consulted another set of papers. "Our latest polling indicates that public opinion is divided but evolving rapidly. Approximately 35% of respondents support Parliament's right to examine royal duties, while 42% view such action as inappropriate interference with the monarchy. The remaining 23% are undecided but open to persuasion." The polling numbers suggested that the battle for public opinion would be crucial to the ultimate resolution of the crisis. Unlike previous royal controversies that had been primarily matters of media coverage and social gossip, this situation would require sustained public engagement and support. "How is the media coverage developing?" Camilla asked. "The initial reports have been surprisingly balanced," Sir Michael replied. "The broadsheets are focusing on the constitutional questions, while the tabloids are divided between supporting you personally and criticizing the precedent your situation might create." Charles stopped pacing and turned to face the group. "We need to understand that whatever decision we make will establish precedents for how future monarchs handle similar challenges. This isn't just about Camilla's position, but about the fundamental relationship between the Crown and Parliament." The King's observation highlighted the broader stakes involved in their decision-making. Any response they chose would become part of constitutional precedent, influencing how future conflicts between royal prerogative and parliamentary authority would be resolved. Camilla stood and walked to the window where Charles had been standing earlier. The palace gardens below showed no signs of the constitutional storm brewing within the building, presenting the same peaceful scene that had comforted countless previous monarchs during their own times of crisis. "I want to be clear about something," she said, turning back to face the group. "I'm not prepared to voluntarily step back from my duties as queen consort. I've worked too hard and sacrificed too much to simply acquiesce to political pressure." Her declaration created a moment of silence in the room as the implications of her position became clear. By refusing to consider voluntary compromise, she was essentially forcing the situation toward either full political confrontation or complete abandonment of Parliament's effort. Charles nodded approvingly. "I support that position completely. We cannot allow the precedent that parliamentary pressure alone is sufficient to modify royal duties." Professor Fleming made notes in her legal pad before responding. "If that's our position, we need to prepare for sustained political and legal battle. Parliament will likely proceed with formal action, and we'll need comprehensive strategies for both legal defense and public relations." "What would such strategies look like?" Camilla asked. Sir Michael opened his briefcase and extracted several additional documents. "We would need coordinated legal representation to challenge any parliamentary action in court. We would also need intensive media management to maintain public support throughout what could be a lengthy process." The prospect of extended legal and political battle was daunting, but Camilla found herself oddly energized by the clarity it provided. After days of uncertainty and speculation, she now understood exactly what she was fighting for and against. "How quickly can we assemble the necessary legal and communications teams?" she asked. "We already have preliminary teams in place, ma'am," Professor Fleming replied. "We can have comprehensive strategies developed within 48 hours. Charles moved to stand beside Camilla, presenting a united front that would be crucial to their success in the coming battle. "Then, we proceed with full resistance to any parliamentary interference with royal duties. We'll fight this both legally and politically." The decision marked a turning point in both the immediate crisis and the broader relationship between the monarchy and modern British democracy. By choosing confrontation over compromise, they were risking a constitutional crisis that could reshape the fundamental structure of British government. As the meeting concluded, Camilla reflected on how quickly her life had changed from the routine duties of royal service to preparation for what could be the most significant constitutional battle in modern British history. The woman who had once been reviled as a destroyer of royal marriage was now positioned as a defender of royal prerogative against parliamentary overreach. The irony was striking, but Camilla found strength in the clarity of her position. She had spent decades proving her worthiness to serve as queen consort, and she was not about to allow political opportunism to undo everything she had accomplished. The battle ahead would be difficult and uncertain, but it was a battle worth fighting for the principles that had sustained the British monarchy through centuries of political and social change. As she prepared to leave the palace for what would likely be her last quiet evening before the public battle began in earnest, Camilla felt the same determination that had carried her through every previous crisis in her remarkable life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and unprecedented pressures, but tonight she would rest in the knowledge that she had chosen to fight rather than surrender. The morning newspapers spread across Camilla's breakfast table painted a picture of a nation divided. The Times led with a measured analysis of constitutional precedents, while The Guardian questioned whether the monarchy had become too powerful for modern democracy. The Daily Mail, predictably, featured a large photograph of Camilla under the headline "Queen Under Fire," while The Telegraph defended royal prerogative in an editorial that called Parliament's action dangerous precedent-setting. The Sun had chosen its typical sensational approach with Crown versus Commons. The battle begins. Camilla read each article carefully, noting how different publications framed the conflict according to their political perspectives and readership expectations. After decades in the public eye, she had learned to analyze media coverage not just for its immediate impact, but for the underlying currents of public opinion it revealed. The diversity of responses suggested that the British public was genuinely divided about the constitutional questions her situation had raised. Her private secretary knocked and entered with the morning's briefing folder, which had grown considerably thicker since the crisis began. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid the situation has escalated overnight." Margaret Thornfield gave an interview to BBC News that aired this morning, and her statements have generated significant additional coverage. Camilla looked up from the newspapers, already dreading what Thornfield might have said. The MP had proven herself adept at using media attention to advance her political career, and a constitutional crisis involving the Queen Consort provided an ideal platform for the kind of reformist positioning that appealed to her political base. "What did she say?" Camilla asked. "She claimed that your position represents an outdated approach to royal duty that fails to reflect modern British values. She specifically referenced your divorce and the circumstances of your marriage to His Majesty as examples of behavior that would be unacceptable in other public servants." The personal attack was not unexpected, but its explicit nature marked an escalation in the political rhetoric surrounding the crisis. By making Camilla's personal history central to her argument, Thornfield was attempting to transform a constitutional debate into a moral judgment about individual character and behavior. "How has the palace responded?" Camilla asked. "Sir Michael issued a brief statement defending your service record and rejecting any attempt to relitigate historical personal matters. However, the media coverage suggests that the personal angle is gaining traction with some segments of the public." Camilla had always known that her personal history would be a vulnerability in any serious political challenge to her position. Despite years of dedicated royal service and gradual public acceptance, the circumstances of her relationship with Charles remained a source of controversy among certain segments of British society. Thornfield's strategy of making personal character central to the constitutional debate was both predictable and potentially effective. Her phone rang, displaying Charles's private number. She answered immediately, knowing that he would be monitoring the morning's developments as closely as she was. "Have you seen Thornfield's interview?" he asked without preamble. "Yes, and I've reviewed the morning papers as well. She's chosen to make this personal, which means we need to respond on both constitutional and personal levels," Charles said. "I've been meeting with our legal team, and they believe we need to address the character questions head-on rather than simply defending royal prerogative." The king's assessment reflected a strategic reality that Camilla had been reluctant to acknowledge. As much as she wanted to keep the debate focused on constitutional principles, her opponents had successfully made her personal worthiness a central issue. Ignoring those attacks would allow them to define the narrative according to their preferred terms. "What kind of personal response are they recommending?" she asked. "A comprehensive public statement addressing your service record, your commitment to royal duty, and your evolution as a person and public servant. Essentially, we need to remind the British public why they learned to accept and support you in the first place." The prospect of revisiting her personal history in such a public forum was daunting, but Camilla understood the strategic necessity. The British public's gradual acceptance of her had been built on their observation of her behavior and dedication over many years. If that acceptance was now being challenged, it would need to be actively defended rather than simply assumed. "When do they want to do this?" she asked. "As soon as possible. Every day we allow Thornfield to control the narrative makes our position more difficult. The legal team believes we should make our statement before Parliament formally begins its proceedings." After ending the call with Charles, Camilla spent several minutes considering the personal and political implications of a comprehensive public defense of her character and service. Such a statement would necessarily involve discussion of painful and controversial periods in her life, including her divorce and the impact of her relationship with Charles on his marriage to Diana. These were topics she had hoped never to address publicly again. But the political reality of her current situation left her with few alternatives. Her equerry entered to inform her that several Commonwealth High Commissioners had requested meetings to discuss their government's concerns about the constitutional crisis. The international dimension of the situation was becoming increasingly prominent as foreign governments struggled to understand how the British political system would resolve an unprecedented challenge to royal authority. "Schedule those meetings for this afternoon," Camilla said. "We need to reassure our international partners that this situation will be resolved in a way that preserves the stability of the monarchy." As she prepared for what would be a challenging day of political and diplomatic meetings, Camilla reflected on how quickly her role had evolved from ceremonial queen consort to defender of constitutional principle. The irony was striking that she, who had once been seen as a threat to the monarchy's stability, was now fighting to preserve its traditional prerogatives against political interference. Her first meeting was with the palace's expanded legal team, which now included several of Britain's most prominent constitutional lawyers. They had been working through the night to analyze Parliament's potential courses of action and develop comprehensive defense strategies for each possible scenario. "The immediate challenge," explained Sir David Morrison, one of the country's leading constitutional experts, "is that Parliament appears to be developing multiple approaches simultaneously. They could pursue legislation, constitutional convention, or formal inquiry with recommendations for action. Each approach would require different defense strategies and would create different precedents for future conflicts between royal prerogative and parliamentary authority." The legal team had identified potential challenges to each approach, but the ultimate success of those challenges would depend as much on political and public support as on legal merit. "What's our strongest legal argument?" Camilla asked. "Royal prerogative," Sir David replied without hesitation. "The Crown has traditionally maintained sole authority over internal royal arrangements, including the duties and roles of family members. Parliament's attempt to interfere with those arrangements represents a significant expansion of legislative power beyond traditional constitutional boundaries." The legal argument was strong, but Camilla understood that legal strength alone would not be sufficient to win a battle that was rapidly becoming as much about public opinion as constitutional law. The British system of government relied on constitutional conventions and public acceptance as much as formal legal mechanisms. "What about the public relations aspect?" she asked. The team's media advisor, Jennifer Walsh, opened her presentation folder. "The polling has shifted slightly since Thornfield's interview this morning. Support for Parliament's action has increased to 40%, while support for your position has decreased to 38%. The undecided group remains significant at 22%. The shift in public opinion was concerning but not unexpected. Thornfield's decision to make personal character central to the debate would naturally appeal to voters who had never fully accepted Camilla's integration into the royal family. However, the large undecided group suggested that public opinion remained malleable and could be influenced by effective communication strategy. "What kind of communications approach can shift those numbers back in our favor?" Camilla asked. Jennifer consulted her notes before responding. "We need a comprehensive campaign that addresses 3 key areas: your service record as queen consort, your personal growth and evolution, and the dangerous precedent that Parliament's action would create for future royal political conflicts. The strategy made sense, but implementing it would require Camilla to engage in exactly the kind of public personal defense that she had hoped to avoid. The alternative, however, was to allow her opponents to continue defining the terms of the debate according to their preferred narrative. As the morning's meetings continued, Camilla began to understand the full scope of the challenge she was facing. This was not simply a political battle or legal dispute, but a comprehensive assault on her legitimacy that would require equally comprehensive defense. Every aspect of her life and service would be scrutinized and debated by the British public, media, and political establishment. The phone rang with news that Margaret Thornfield had called for a formal parliamentary debate on the constitutional questions surrounding Camilla's position. The motion had already attracted support from over 60 MPs and was likely to be scheduled within the next 2 weeks. A formal debate changes the dynamic significantly, Sir David observed. It transforms this from a political inquiry into a public trial, with all the media attention and public scrutiny that implies. Camilla felt a surge of determination at the news. If Parliament wanted a public debate about her worthiness to serve as Queen Consort, she would give them exactly that. After decades of careful diplomacy and measured public statements, she was prepared to defend herself with the same directness that had carried her through every previous crisis in her remarkable life. Then, we prepare for public battle, she said. If they want to debate my character and service record in Parliament, we'll make sure that debate includes a comprehensive accounting of everything I've accomplished as Queen Consort and everything I represent for the modern monarchy. The decision to embrace rather than avoid the public battle marked a crucial turning point in both the immediate crisis and Camilla's approach to defending her position. Rather than relying solely on constitutional arguments and royal prerogative, she would stake her claim to continued service on her record of accomplishment and her value to the British people and the Commonwealth. As she prepared for the afternoon's meetings with Commonwealth representatives, Camilla reflected on how the crisis had evolved from a private constitutional matter into a public referendum on her worthiness to serve as Queen Consort. The challenge was daunting, but it was also clarifying. After years of gradual acceptance and careful public relations management, she would finally have the opportunity to make a comprehensive case for her continued role in the modern British monarchy. The battle ahead would be intense and uncertain, but Camilla found herself oddly energized by the prospect of finally being able to defend herself and her service record without the careful diplomatic constraints that usually governed royal public statements. If Parliament wanted a debate about the modern monarchy's relationship with British democracy, she would give them a debate they would never forget. The Westminster Hall had not witnessed such a charged atmosphere since the great constitutional debates of the 19th century. Every seat in the historic chamber was occupied as members of Parliament gathered for what many observers were already calling the most significant royal political confrontation in modern British history. The ancient stone walls seemed to vibrate with tension as Margaret Thornfield rose to present her case for limiting the Queen Consort's constitutional role. Camilla watched the proceedings from the royal gallery, a position that placed her physically above the debate while making her the undeniable focus of every argument presented below. Charles sat beside her, his presence demonstrating royal unity, while his careful attention to every speaker revealed the gravity with which the Crown was treating this unprecedented challenge to royal prerogative. Honorable members, Thornfield began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. We gather today to address fundamental questions about the role of unelected individuals in modern British democracy. The position of Queen Consort, as currently constituted, represents an outdated approach to public service that fails to reflect contemporary standards of accountability and moral leadership. The opening statement was carefully crafted to frame the debate in terms of democratic principle rather than personal attack, though Camilla understood that personal criticisms would inevitably follow. Thornfield had proven herself a skilled political strategist, and her approach suggested she intended to build a broad coalition by appealing to both constitutional reformers and moral traditionalists. The response came from Sir William Hartwell, a Conservative MP and longtime defender of royal prerogative. The honorable member's motion represents nothing less than an assault on the constitutional foundations that have sustained British democracy for centuries. The relationship between Crown and Parliament has evolved through careful tradition and precedent, not through hasty legislative intervention in matters of royal prerogative. As the debate continued, Camilla observed how different speakers approached the central questions from varying political and philosophical perspectives. Some focused on the constitutional implications of parliamentary interference in royal affairs, while others addressed the practical challenges of modern royal service in an era of increased public scrutiny and democratic accountability. The Liberal Democrat leader, Sarah Mitchell, offered a perspective that attempted to bridge the competing positions. While we must respect the traditional independence of the Crown in managing its internal affairs, we cannot ignore the legitimate concerns about transparency and accountability that affect all public institutions in the 21st century. Each speech was carefully monitored by palace staff for both immediate political impact and longer-term constitutional implications. The precedents established by this debate would influence royal political relationships for generations, making every argument and every vote crucial to the future structure of British government. Margaret Thornfield rose again to present what appeared to be her most pointed criticism of Camilla's position. We must ask ourselves whether the circumstances surrounding the Queen Consort's path to her current role meet the standards we expect of public servants in other areas of government. Would we accept similar personal history from a cabinet minister or senior civil servant? The personal attack was direct and calculated to appeal to voters who had never fully accepted Camilla's integration into the royal family. By comparing royal service to other forms of public service, Thornfield was attempting to subject the monarchy to standards of evaluation that had never previously been applied to hereditary institutions. Sir William immediately rose to respond. The honorable member's comparison is fundamentally flawed. The monarchy is not a political office subject to the same standards as elected or appointed positions. Royal service is based on hereditary right and constitutional tradition, not on personal qualification as evaluated by contemporary political standards. The exchange highlighted the fundamental philosophical divide underlying the entire debate. Thornfield and her supporters viewed the monarchy as a public institution that should be subject to democratic oversight and contemporary moral standards. The royal defenders maintained that the Crown's constitutional independence was essential to its role as a stabilizing force above partisan political conflict. From her position in the gallery, Camilla could see members of Parliament consulting notes and whispering among themselves as they prepared to vote on various aspects of Thornfield's motion. The political dynamics were complex, with traditional party loyalties complicated by personal views about the monarchy and individual assessments of Camilla's service record. Charles leaned over to whisper in her ear, "Whatever the outcome, we've made our position clear. The precedent we've established by fighting this battle will be as important as the immediate result." The king's observation reflected the broader stakes involved in the day's proceedings. Even if Parliament passed some form of motion critical of Camilla's position, the royal family's decision to resist rather than compromise had demonstrated that they would not voluntarily surrender constitutional prerogatives in response to political pressure. As the afternoon debate continued, several speakers addressed the international implications of Parliament's action. The Canadian High Commissioner had submitted a formal statement expressing concern about the stability of Commonwealth constitutional arrangements, while several Australian MPs had issued similar warnings about the precedent being established for other Commonwealth realms. Lord Chancellor Patricia Whitmore presented her office's legal analysis, which had been eagerly anticipated by both sides of the debate. Our review of constitutional precedents indicates that while theoretical mechanisms exist for parliamentary involvement in royal arrangements, the implementation of such mechanisms would create unprecedented tension between legislative authority and royal prerogative. Her carefully neutral language concealed what Camilla understood to be significant legal concerns about the constitutional implications of Parliament's proposed action. The Lord Chancellor's office had clearly identified potential legal challenges to any legislation affecting royal duties, though they had stopped short of explicitly advising against such action. The debate's climax came when Margaret Thornfield presented her formal motion calling for a parliamentary committee to develop recommendations for limiting the Queen Consort's official duties pending a review of her fitness for continued service. The motion was carefully worded to avoid direct challenges to royal prerogative while establishing a mechanism for ongoing parliamentary oversight of royal appointments and duties. The vote, when it finally came, reflected the deep divisions within Parliament and British society more broadly. Thornfield's motion passed by a narrow margin of 12 votes, with significant support coming from MPs representing constituencies where public opinion polls had shown strong support for royal reform. However, the narrow victory came with important limitations. The motion's language had been modified during the debate to reduce its immediate practical impact, and several key provisions had been removed entirely in response to concerns about constitutional overreach. What emerged was a compromise that established parliamentary authority to review royal arrangements without directly challenging the Crown's ultimate authority over such matters. As the session concluded, Camilla and Charles made their way through the palace corridors surrounded by advisors and staff members who were already analyzing the political and constitutional implications of the vote. The immediate crisis had been resolved through political compromise, but the broader questions about the relationship between monarchy and democracy in modern Britain remained unsettled. The motion passed, but it's been significantly weakened, Sir Michael reported as they walked. The parliamentary committee will have review authority, but no direct power to modify your duties without Crown consent. The outcome represented a partial victory for both sides. Parliament had established the principle that royal arrangements were subject to democratic oversight, while the Crown had preserved its ultimate authority over internal family matters. Camilla's immediate position was secure, but the precedent established by the debate would influence royal political relationships for years to come. In the weeks that followed, the parliamentary committee began its review with public hearings that allowed both supporters and critics of Camilla's position to present their cases. The hearings provided a forum for comprehensive discussion of her service record, her personal growth since joining the royal family, and her contributions to British public life. The committee's final report, published 3 months after the Westminster Hall debate, concluded that while legitimate questions could be raised about various aspects of royal service in the modern era, there was insufficient evidence to recommend any modification of the Queen Consort's current duties. The report specifically noted Camilla's dedication to charitable causes, her effective representation of British interests internationally, and her successful adaptation to royal responsibility. More significantly, the report recommended that future reviews of royal arrangements should be conducted through established constitutional mechanisms rather than ad hoc parliamentary intervention. This recommendation effectively established the precedent that while Parliament retained the theoretical authority to examine royal affairs, such examinations should be rare and conducted according to formal procedures that respected royal prerogative. Margaret Thornfield's political career continued to flourish in the years following the constitutional crisis, as she had successfully positioned herself as a champion of democratic reform and institutional accountability. However, her failure to achieve significant modification of royal arrangements limited her ability to claim the constitutional victory she had originally sought. For Camilla, the resolution of the crisis marked not just the preservation of her position, but the establishment of her legitimacy through democratic process rather than royal tradition alone. Having defended her service record in the most public forum possible, she had finally achieved the kind of comprehensive public validation that no amount of careful public relations management could have provided. The constitutional precedents established by the crisis continued to influence British politics for years afterward. The principle that Parliament could review royal arrangements while respecting Crown prerogative created a framework for addressing future conflicts between democratic accountability and royal independence without resorting to the kind of constitutional crisis that had characterized Camilla's experience. As she returned to her regular duties as Queen Consort, Camilla reflected on how the greatest challenge of her royal career had ultimately strengthened both her personal position and the institutional framework that supported the monarchy's relationship with modern British democracy. The woman who had once been viewed as a threat to royal stability had become a defender of constitutional tradition, while the political system that had challenged her authority had ultimately validated her service through the most rigorous democratic scrutiny possible. The legacy of the Westminster Hall debate would be remembered not as a victory for either monarchy or Parliament, but as a demonstration of how British constitutional tradition could adapt to modern democratic expectations while preserving the essential characteristics that had sustained the nation's political stability for centuries. In defending herself, Camilla had inadvertently strengthened the very system that had put her on trial.